Welcome to Aston Means Business, a podcast from Aston Business School. My name's Steve Dyson, and I'm a journalist who's interviewing some of the UK's top business academics here at Aston. This podcast has been going since October 2019, and there are now more than 35 previous episodes that you can listen to by simply Googling Aston Means Business. In today's episode, we're going to explore shared and distributed leadership and those who are able to be trusted second-in-commands. We'll be looking at how these models can be crucial to business success. Joining me to discuss these concepts is Dr Lloyd Parsons, the Interim Director of MBA Programmes here at Aston Business School. Hello, Lloyd.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for having me. Much appreciated.
No problems, Lloyd. I want to find out a little bit about who you are first, where you've worked before the university sector, what brought you to Aston, and what you teach and research here.
As you mentioned, I'm the Interim Director of MBA Programmes. I'm also the Director of Executive MBA Programmes as well. So I tend to work with people that are in businesses and organisations, middle to senior managers, and they're embarking on a programme of personal and professional development over 2 years with us. And really that, I guess, would lead me into a little bit about my background as well. So I've been at Aston, I've been involved with Aston for probably 3 years. I've been full-time at Aston for a little over 2 years. And I've come from a variety of different backgrounds. I've worked for a number of different universities. So before I was here at Aston, I was at the University of Gloucestershire. Prior to that, I was at the University of Worcester. And I've experienced as a student, as an academic, a number of different places, both here in the UK, and I've worked on international projects as well. I tend to refer to myself as the accidental academic on account of the fact I never intended to be one. So I never had the intention of doing this. I probably worked pretty hard at school to be pretty average. And for anybody that is a school kid, that's not the combination that you want, hard work for average returns. So I had a background that started in the armed forces many years ago. And I've been involved in the forces for a number of years previously. I then moved out of the military, and in going through my own academic career later in life, I did a lot of that with part-time degrees, undergraduate bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, etc. And my love afterwards was in sport. And I worked in sport for a number of years and then ended up falling into the world of industry, financial services, construction and engineering, medical and pharmaceuticals, and then embarked on my own part-time PhD, which led me into the universities. And that kind of ended up with me falling into this world of academia and loving it ever since. So I really enjoy the university environment, but being in a business school, I think it's really nice and important that not only do I have the kind of letters and the experience and some of the things that go with it that you would expect as somebody that teaches in a business school, but I've also got the industry background as well. So I've lived and breathed many of the challenges that hopefully our listeners, I'm sure, will relate to throughout the course of today. My field of teaching is leadership. So this for me is a great podcast to talk about. And my doctorate is all about leadership decision making. So I'm really fascinated about how leaders make high stakes decisions in organizations and businesses.
That's a really interesting background. And with leadership in mind, we're talking today, first of all, about shared and distributed leadership. Tell us more about the theories behind this model.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think one of the reasons why we probably want to speak about them today is that they're lesser known things. So quite often in businesses and organizations, and we'll probably touch on these later, that there are well-established expectations of what leaders should be, who leaders should be. And quite often we've got very formalized views in our heads, either through our upbringing or through organizations and their hierarchy. But we've got very firm visions of who a leader is and equally who a leader is not. And shared and distributed leadership come at things from a slightly different angle. So if we look at shared leadership as an example, the basis there is that it's not about an individual. Actually, it's far more about a team, a collective, something that I guess you might be thinking is maybe more akin to a board. You have a group that sit as your leadership council. What we will often see in that type of organization, though, is that you'll still have a figurehead. You'll have a CEO, you'll have a managing director. And therefore, whilst you have representation, you still really have one true leader. And shared leadership is about trying to dispel some of that and really mean that there is a collective democratic group that take the role and responsibility of leadership within the organization and not just that figurehead that sits on top. And distributed leadership is a slightly different take on that still. Distributed leadership, there are a number of different definitions, but I guess one of the core cruxes of this is realizing that people will step into and out of leadership roles as and when the situation, the context, the environment, the requirement for technical knowledge and skill dictate. So it's less about having a permanent static leader and more about having some of that flexibility and agility within an organization where people can move forwards and backwards from those leadership roles as and when it dictates, which sounds easy. But as we have probably all listening to this podcast have got our experiences of flat organizations, tall organizations with big hierarchy and bureaucracy, that sounds like a romantic notion that's probably easier to say than it is to deliver.
You mentioned the army in your own background, and I'm interested in how sometimes the army has had that serve to lead principle. Is the way that armed services are led effectively a good example of shared and distributed leadership?
I think it can be. So the piece that you're sort of quoting and leading in with there, the serve to lead, is one of the core mottos of the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst. I think that the armed forces can produce some fabulous examples of good things of leadership, but we have to take the right stuff, because quite often people's thoughts and understanding of the military is governed and influenced and impacted by the things that people see on television, whether or not those are movies, whether or not they're dramas and depictions. And there's all too much of the drill sergeant shouting at people, the physical training instructor telling people to do press-ups, and too much of that kind of authoritarian type of approach. Whereas actually, for anybody that's spent time in a military environment, there are lots of opportunities for people to contribute, to share their knowledge, their skills, and their expertise. That can differ in a conflict type of environment where having those clear lines of authority is super important. But outside of that kind of high pressure, highly chaotic conflict environment, actually there's a lot of shared and distributed leadership that you would see. The rank structure lends itself to that, in that you have different levels of authority and therefore different levels of role and responsibility. But also the fact that you've got a lot of people, very, very bright, intelligent people with some fabulous specialist skills. And therefore, not that I've ever been this, but as a military commander or a senior officer, you have to understand, of course, that the people around you are the resource that you require to fulfill an objective. And therefore, you can't do everything. And you have to be able to delegate, you have to be able to trust, you have to be able to provide orders and instructions. And I think that if we take those things from the military environments, there are brilliant lessons that we can learn in terms of how to share, how to distribute, how to delegate, and how to disperse leadership throughout an entire organization, as opposed to being solely dependent on one or two individuals in a business or in any organization.
I understand. And the armed services aside, Lloyd, what else would you point to as a good example of shared and distributed leadership in wider society, history, business, politics? What would you say is a good example?
Well, I think if you look back on sort of history and various different sort of environments and things like this, we get very hung up on, I will refer to it, and you'll find it in the literature, as like hero leadership, where we're trying to put one person up and sort of emanate one person as being the figurehead, whether or not that's Churchill, Nelson Mandela, or whoever else. These are people that quite often, when I deliver leadership workshops, we quite rightly talk about these, but they're figureheads. And the problem with having a figurehead that's running those things is it's sometimes hard to relate when your figurehead is somebody that liberated occupied Europe or campaigned for equal rights in post-apartheid South Africa. These are hard things when we're just trying to go to work, hit our KPIs and fulfill our business challenges. So I think one of the things that we see in terms of good examples of shared and distributed leadership out there in organizations in history, you look at Steve Jobs. And I'm not a massive Jobs fan, but it's a good thing that most people can relate to, and most people kind of have an understanding of Steve Jobs. There's a brilliant quote or example in the Michael Fassbender film called Jobs. And there's a disagreement between Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs, both the founding partners of Apple. And Steve Wozniak, who has the background as the computer scientist, the programmer, he's got kind of really emotional with Jobs, and he says to him, "What do you do?" And he asks it as this really sort of, it's not a glib question, it's a really direct. He says, "What do you do? You don't program anything, you don't build anything, what do you do here?" And Jobs has this beautiful response, which is, "I play the orchestra. I'm not here to be a single contributor. I'm here to sort of bring everything together." And that, I guess, is one of those nice examples of having that sort of central figurehead. But even if you take Jobs and even if you take Apple, one person can't achieve all of those things in an organization. So you have to surround yourself with good people. And in the case of Apple, even to this day, you've got designers, programmers, you've got software engineers, all manner of people that need to come together in order to build a great organization. So I think, if you move it outside of that environment, you see examples in business, in politics as well. It's, again, maybe politics at this moment in time is not necessarily the finest example to possibly give, but you see that people can't do everything. If you look at the responses that we've had to the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen the PM going out and doing his daily briefings in various parts and various times, and he's surrounded by his chief medical officer, his chief advisors, chief scientist. And really, I think that's a lovely example playing out almost in real time of what we've seen in recent history of needing to surround yourself with good people and needing to take their expertise and their advice and really be able to work that into what an organization does going forwards. So I think there are a number of examples.
Let's move on to discussing those who are able to be the trusted second in command, Lloyd. Why can that be crucial to business success?
I've had the privilege of being involved in and delivering workshops and talking about the topic of leadership all over the world, lots of different organizations. And I find it fascinating that I've never been asked to or approached to discuss the topic of followership. All of the time, talk about leadership. I'm a senior teaching fellow in leadership. I research in leadership. If you Google books on leadership, you'll find literally thousands of them. And followership is this far lesser known or lesser appreciated kind of field. And I think that's really important because quite often it means that we build very tall organizations with lots of hierarchy and everybody wants to be the leader. But we want people that can support us as leaders as well. And that actually starts with us examining what a good follower is. And this idea of kind of the trusted advisor, the good second in command, as it were, is a role that I'm a huge fan of. I think, dare I say it, in my own level and my own roles previously, I've been able to play this role and do this quite well. But it's really about the idea of people being able to be the trusted counsel, the advisor, being able to contribute and be involved in the decision making, but without the need to always be the decision maker. And the idea of followership, I think, is a really important one that organizations should consider, but so should individuals as well. If you want to progress your own career, there is a likelihood that you will do a little bit of managing up. And quite often, if people move out of organizations or they move laterally, if you want to apply for that post, I think people want to see that you are potentially somebody that can follow, support, be a good team player. And if it's all me, my problems, my goals and objectives, that can create quite a, I guess, a sort of inward-looking individual, which maybe that might work for you in terms of your career. Maybe it might hinder you. But I think the idea of followership is really, really important. There's a guy called Richard Heitner. He was the former deputy, as a matter of fact, I think he's still the deputy chairman at Saatchi & Saatchi. And he wrote a fabulous book called Consigliere. And its strapline is called Leading from the Shadows. And really, this brings to life this idea that you don't have to be number one, which I think if we look at maybe some of the things that we get brought up with, the stories, the movies and things like that, everything celebrates being number one, and it's, number one or nothing at all. And in actual fact, there is a real great opportunity for people in organizations to find great success in being that trusted counsel, that number two, not quite at the very pinnacle at the front, running and moving the organization forwards, but very much involved in it on a day-to-day basis.
Yes, I recognise this from my own background, Lloyd, which was in the once thriving media industry of daily newspapers. The editor, I was an editor myself, he or she was always seen as the main leader, the man or woman in charge. Everyone looked up to them and wanted a decision from them every day, all the time. And yet, they were often away from the floor in meetings about finance, staffing, logistics, advertising, or whatever else was needed upstairs. A good editor always, therefore, had a dependable deputy without whom the newspaper would never have come out on a daily basis.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great example. And I think that the key thing about being that deputy is it's often about prioritizing the team around you. It's not necessarily about your success. And if you were that way inclined, you'd probably be wanting to be the editor, the person that's the CEO, the MD. And it's not to say that you can't move into those roles, but it's a very different skill set. So you mentioned, the editor is maybe not on the shop floor as it might be and working at the coalface. And I think that's a real key point, is that the role of this trusted second in command has the ability to work at a number of different levels. And I find that fascinating. We see some great examples in history of this as well. So Gordon Brown, very successful Chancellor of the Exchequer, 10 years in that role, but thrust into a very different role when he became PM. So Tony Blair stands down, Gordon Brown moves into that role. And it's a whole different dynamic in terms of what people expect from you, the demands, the capacity. And therefore, that there are different challenges that go with that as well. I think if you look at even the word, so going back to Richard Heitner's book, consigliere, the word is kind of derived, the etymology of it comes from counsel, advisor, this trusted individual. And we see that with some of the sort of papacy positions, so the consigliere to the Pope, the Council of Cardinals, things like that. And this gets picked up and depicted quite beautifully in some of the sort of Mafia connotation films as well. So we saw this with Tom Hagen in The Godfather, played by Robert Duvall. And he's this really enigmatic character that can kind of be that trusted advisor, that right-hand man, that sense check quite often. And I think, again, we saw this with Silvio Dante in The Sopranos as well.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Advisor to Tony Soprano. And these roles, I think, are super, super fascinating, because one of the things is that they provide advice, they provide counsel, they can lead, but without necessarily being the figurehead. They pull a lot of the strings in the background. And I think, in businesses and organizations, if you are a leader and you're listening to this podcast, I think one of the things to maybe consider is, who is your consigliere? If you are the person that is out there as the leader, who's your follower? Who's your right hand that will help you to deliver, that will help you to get things done, but also that will challenge you? Because the right hand is never just about saying, yes, sir, or yes, boss, let's get on with it. The right hand is that person that can also give you their thoughts, and they speak very deliberately, and they pick their times and their moments, and they can be hugely impactful. They're not trying to run the organization. They're just trying to share with you their thoughts and their wisdom and give you that trusted counsel, as it were.
Yeah, fantastic role, and one which is very underrated, I think, that person who can help deliver, really, whatever that operation happens to be. I think you've explained both models really well, Lloyd, and I can see the benefits of shared and distributed leadership and the need for that trusted second in command. Just to ask you a final question, what are your top tips for young leaders wanting to take something away from this? What's the overall guidance which bridges the issues and the themes that you've been talking about?
I think one of the major ones is trust. Building it, cultivating it, growing it, giving it to other people as well. If you're somebody that's listening to this podcast and you've got aspirations to move into a leadership role, or maybe you're there at the moment and you want to continue that on, I think a key element of this is trust. And it's very easy for people to look out in organizations and think, I'm great. I could solve all the problems here. If somebody just trusted me to really own this, I could run this business better. I could make more money. I could get rid of all these problems if somebody just trusted and put me in charge. And I think that's a really interesting bit, because if you consider that, the fact of the matter is, well, if you're not in charge, it's not to say that people don't trust you, but you really need to work on being that trusted individual. So being able to instill trust in others that work with and around you, being able to be trusted by the people above and around you in your peer group as well. And that means, for me, really, when it's your opportunity and you get the chance to own something, don't drop the ball. Really work on owning that, making your deliverables clear, articulate them, and then make sure you deliver on them. And if you do drop the ball, because life happens, this isn't just us sat on a fluffy cloud. If you do drop the ball, own it and show how you're going to make up for it. And I think those are things that help to give and instill trust in you, because ultimately, if you want to go into a leadership role, the people that are going to be your peers, the people that are already in that position, they want to see that you've got a plan, that they've got confidence in your ability to deliver on that plan as well, and that you understand your remit of control, your remit of influence, and therefore you're going to garner and sort of glean their trust as you move forward. So I think for me, that's a really, really key one. The second one that I would just kind of finish on there, and this I think is probably the hardest thing for new leaders, is realizing that you can't do it all on your own. You've probably got into the position that you're in, if you're new to leadership or if you've kind of ascended quite rapidly in your career, you've probably got into that position because you deliver brilliantly on your projects and you can manage and coordinate people at your level. But when you move up into that next level and you're commanding more resource, more people, more impact, more ownership, all of those things, you've got to do more with others. And I think that's a key bit. There's only so much effort that you can put in. There's only so many hours in a day. And I think that a key bit is realizing that there comes a transition where it's less about you, that model that we started with, hero leadership, and it's far more about the team and the collective, thus kind of segueing us back to the idea of shared and distributed leadership and its importance in an organization.
And I guess in some ways, finding the time to coach and develop those people so that they're there for you.
Oh, absolutely. If you want to build trust, if you want to sort of build capability of the resource around you, you absolutely have to invest the time. And that's really hard. When you've got deliverables, when you've got projects stacked up, when you've got an inbox that is constantly on explode mode, creating the time and space to work with, nurture, cultivate, and grow the talent around you is a really hard thing to do. But of course, it's a long-term investment. You might have, as a leader, some of those short-term pains of high demands, of high projects, of low resource. But if you can upskill, develop the capability, broaden the remit that people have in terms of what they can contribute to, I think you're going to move on a huge amount, not only in being able to manage what currently exists, but add to the future value and impact of what you can deliver as a leader through your team in the future as well.
Dr Lloyd Parsons, the Interim Director of MBA Programmes here at Aston Business School. Many thanks for joining Aston Means Business today.
Thanks very much indeed. I really appreciate it. I had a great time.
Thanks for listening out there to Aston Means Business, an original podcast for Aston University. Remember, if you enjoyed today's episode, you can find earlier episodes by simply Googling Aston Means Business. And if you're interested in studying anything to do with business, finance and economics, why not check out what Aston University has to offer at www.aston.ac.uk/courses. We've also got a podcast series called Society Matters, which interviews top academics at Aston's School of Social Sciences and Humanities about current issues and concepts which shape our world and the way that people live. You can find those episodes simply by Googling Society Matters Aston. Meanwhile, we'll be back soon with more interviews from some of the UK's top business academics here at Aston. Aston Means Business. Thanks for listening.